Hi, this is Stephanie Miller from The Stephanie Miller Show. Please enjoy this exclusive clip from my show on Political Voices Network.
So, Barb, where do we even start? Obviously, yes, I admit it is a little bit of a liberal wet dream that he goes to prison. And I love the he, we just know who we mean.
Right.
But, Norm Eisen and, Glenn Kirshner, our friend, have said, based on the facts and the number of gag order violations, it would not be out of the realm of possibility, would it? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. This is one of those situations where people say, if his name were anything other than Donald J. Trump, he wouldn't have been charged with a crime in the first place. I would say if his name were anything other than Donald J. Trump, he would be looking at jail time, I think. The penalties for this crime are up to 4 years per count, which is times 34. It's 136 years, but, typically nobody gets that kind of time. They are usually served concurrently. So I think most people look at 4 years as the max. And then you try to look at comparables. Sometimes the falsified records are to conceal some multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. So this one's a little bit apples and oranges because you don't have a dollar value, but you do have corrupting an election. Mm-hmm. And what's that worth? And so I think it'll be very difficult to find comparables in a case like this. But on the other hand, as you point out, there are some real aggravating factors here. One of the things judges typically look at in deciding what a sentence ought to be is the person's remorse and their expression of contrition, going before the court. Most defendants say, I'm sorry, I've learned so much from this experience. I brought shame to myself and my family. I'm so sorry to what I've done. I don't expect to be hearing that from Donald Trump. And so that's a factor that weighs in favor of imprisonment. And as you pointed out, the repeated violations of the gag order, while Donald Trump was sentenced to fines for those things, I think the court can still consider that behavior in imposing sentence, because one of the goals of criminal prosecution is to promote respect for the law. And certainly Donald Trump has yet to show any respect for the law. So those cut in favor. I guess I'd still be surprised to see him get prison time, but I think Alvin Bragg will ask for it. And I think those would be the bases on which his request relies.
Wow. And you, thank God for you, Barb, but you like just knocking down a lot of, stuff on Twitter. You said there is another false argument floating around. The prosecution did not reveal the crime Trump was accused of committing till closing arguments. That's false. The offense was charged in the indictment, and the unlawful means were disclosed in legal filings in November 2023. And by the way, don't they ask the defendant, do you understand the charges against you? Donald Trump said yes. So this was more lies, right? They didn't even tell me what I did. Or, go ahead.
It's just another effort to undermine the prosecution. I think like many white collar crimes, this one's a little bit complicated. It's not the kind of thing that is familiar to jurors, things when a bank gets robbed. I always love bank robbery cases because everybody understands it. Everybody knows what happens when a bank gets robbed. But most white collar crimes are actually somewhat complex, and that's because they make efforts to conceal what they're doing. And this one is no exception. But I actually looked at this recently, Stephanie, and on the day of the indictment, Alvin Bragg actually included a chart that showed what that underlying crime was. It was not specified in the indictment, and New York law does not require that it be specified. But as early as November of 2023, there was a prosecution filing that detailed all of the predicate crimes that this was based on. So the idea that Trump somehow was blindsided and didn't have the ability to defend himself at trial in May is absurd.
Well, right. You said the criticism Alvin Bragg somehow improperly turned 34 misdemeanors into felonies is a fallacy. The legislature did that by adding enhanced penalties when someone falsifies records to conceal another crime. That's because it's a more serious offense deserving of higher punishment. You said Bragg's power was checked by the grand jury that indicted the case, the defense lawyers who argued for Trump and cross-examined witnesses, the judge who oversaw the pretrial litigation and trial, and jurors who found guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And you say then he gets appeals. That's due process. But he keeps saying stuff, right? Like, oh, they didn't allow us to call witnesses. We weren't allowed to call our election expert. Like, I guess because some segment of his idiot fans believe that, right?
Yeah, this all goes back to his MO of, I just need an investigation to announce, just say there was fraud in the election and leave the rest to me. He does take a germ of truth, just a germ, and then he distorts it to suggest that somehow he's the victim and turn it into a grievance. But, this idea that it should have been a misdemeanor, it's a bookkeeping error, something like that. All crimes are structured that way. There is a simple form that has a less serious penalty, and there are more aggravated forms that have higher penalties. For example, the federal drug statutes. It is a misdemeanor to possess small quantities of drugs that are banned substances. But those escalate depending on the quantity or whether you have an intent to distribute, and they can go all the way up to life in prison, depending on those things. And so it's no different in this case. A simple falsification of bank records is one thing, and with an intent to conceal another crime is another. And that's what he did, and that's what a jury convicted him of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah. And this is why your book is so important on disinformation, attack from within. Because you also tweeted, by denying he led chants of lock her up, Trump is asking the people to put tribe over truth. The point is not to convince his followers that the lie is true. The point is to convince his followers to repeat the lie, even though it's false. Choose truth over tribe. I mean, how quickly did the news channels produce, I don't know how many video clips of him saying lock her up? I mean, it's just, this is the final command, right? To disregard what you see with your eyes and hear with your ears.
Absolutely. That is the point. The idea is, this is what our team is saying. We're the red team. They're the blue team. There are only two choices in this world. And if you want to be on board the team, this is what you say. And we've seen this throughout Trump's administration. Mike Pompeo, when he was director of the CIA, made comments. I think maybe it was even when he was Secretary of State, made jokes about Donald Trump's third term. You know, it's not funny. It is not a joke. People believe these things, and it normalizes this way of thinking. People know what is true and what is false, but they're willing to go along with the con because they care more about winning than they care about truth. And as Liz Cheney said, we cannot long remain a democracy without a reliance on truth.
Yeah. Well, so Barb, I feel like there's a new assault on our justice system in some way every day. But the Speaker of the House of Representatives saying, "Oh, I've spoken to some Supreme Court justices. They need to overturn this." I mean, my first question, I couldn't wait to talk to you because I'm like, wait, can they? What? A state conviction? Can they do that? I mean, you know, Neil Katyal says he doesn't think so. Can you tell us your take on that? How can the Supreme Court overturn a state conviction?
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly inappropriate on a couple of levels. I mean, first, the idea that, yeah, you know, I know a few people on the Supreme Court, and I talk to them all the time, and I'm pretty sure they're going to overturn this. I mean, what does that suggest? That they're out there whispering to their pals that don't worry about it, we got Trump's back? I mean, that really undermines public confidence, I think, in our Supreme Court, and was a terrible thing to say. And, you know, who knows whether it's even true. But with regard to the specific question of whether the Supreme Court can intervene, and, you know, many people are saying should intervene, you know, before the election. That's just not going to happen. There's zero chance of that. And that's because a defendant in a criminal case must exhaust his appeals in order. And so there is an intermediate appellate court in New York. I am sure Donald Trump will appeal his conviction there. He can then go to the New York Supreme Court. We'll see whether that affirms his conviction, and then and only if he's got a specific issue relating to a federal statute or a federal constitutional right, can that case go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So if he argues, for example, that he was denied due process by one of these things he's arguing about, that is an issue that the U.S. Supreme Court could take up. But after he exhausts all of these other appeals, which will certainly take well over a year to do.
Yeah. For us non-lawyers, Barb, 34 counts, unanimous, all guilty. What are the chances on appeal? I don't get, you know, I mean, I get that he's going to appeal, but what do you think the chances are?
Well, I don't think there will be an overturning of the jury's findings. Jurors get a lot of deference. The standard is really high that the evidence was insufficient for any rational trier of fact to have found guilt. And I don't think that's going to be disturbed. There was plenty of evidence here on the facts. I think the issues that will be handled on appeal are the kinds of things that are typical, which are legal errors. So, for example, was the way the indictment read without specifying that underlying crime legally sound? Now, there's lots of New York case law on it that says that it is. Was the decision to limit the expert's testimony to matters of fact and not law a legal error? I'm sure he'll raise that issue. Again, under New York law, under really the law of every jurisdiction, experts are supposed to be experts in the law. They're supposed to be experts in the fact to assist the jury in their fact finding because judges are the experts in the law. So statute of limitations, right? There were some rules about tolling of the statute of limitations because Donald Trump was outside the state of New York and because of COVID. Was that all constitutionally kosher? Again, I think so. There were findings about those things. But to me, those are more likely to be the kinds of issues that Trump raises on appeal. but I think his likelihood of a reversal are very, very slim.
Yeah, that's okay. Me too, and I went to zero law school. Okay, except talking to you every week. So I wanted to get your take. Jamie Raskin wrote a piece for the New York Times. He said many people have gloomily accepted the conventional wisdom because there's no binding Supreme Court ethics code. There's no way to force Alito and Thomas to recuse themselves from the J6 cases. He says the Department of Justice can petition the 7 other justices to require Alito and Thomas to recuse themselves, not as a matter of grace, but as a matter of law. He said, I look forward to seeing 7 members of the court act to defend the reputation and integrity of the institution. What is your take on that? Because it just seems so egregious that Alito and Thomas are not recusing.
So I think it's a really interesting idea, and my guess is it will not be successful. And here's why. But it still is an idea that is worth communicating. So as he says, there is a statute that says judges and justices should recuse themselves if their impartiality can reasonably be questioned. And then talks about the examples of Alito and Thomas in these January 6 cases and why they should be recusing, and asking the other justices, if they say, well, we can only police ourselves because of separation of powers issues, like, well, go ahead, police thyself. Here you go. 7 other members of the court. You can do this. You have the power to do this. And I think he's right. Yeah. I just think it's unlikely that the 7 other members are going to do this because, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think they are protective of each other. And so I'd be surprised if they take him up on this invitation, even though it's a really interesting idea. But here's why I like the expression of this idea. Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, once wrote that dissenting opinions make no difference in this case. But when you write a dissent, you're writing for the future because other people are going to look at that argument and take it up and give it some thought and think about it. Yeah. And so even if it doesn't happen today, I think it puts an idea out there. It's like law review articles. People argue about changes in the law and expansion of rights. A famous one example in my own law school is Miranda. There was a professor at Michigan Law School in the 1960s who had this idea about warning criminal defendants of their rights. And people said, forget about it. That's not in the Constitution. And later, people adopted those ideas and put them into practice. And it eventually became enshrined in the Miranda ruling by the Supreme Court. So in the same way, by putting this idea out there and giving it oxygen and have people talking about it and normalizing it, perhaps it will become a way of doing business at the Supreme Court down the road.
Okay. See, and I thought it was Miranda from Sex and the City when she told Carrie not to wear the shoes.
Miranda was not that Miranda.
Miranda was a man.
I would have failed Barb's class.
He was a man.
Okay. Let's end on a good note. Trump's first criminal conviction is likely to enable a snowball effect when it comes to guilty verdicts in future trials, according to one legal analyst. Trump's enablers on the Supreme Court should have rejected it like all the other courts did. Instead, they're taking months. They've taken 5 months to consider whether a president can order political assassinations with SEAL Team 6. I have to say, we have to take some heart in what 12 humble jurors did that no one else has been able to accomplish, including the Supreme Court, yet is holding him to account for something, right? And that it will make it more likely in the future.
Yeah, from my perspective, this should be a moment to celebrate the rule of law. That's the law that says that none of us are above the law. All people are treated equally under the law, including the most powerful, like former presidents. And this jury, saw through all of the smokescreen of defense. They saw the evidence in court. They watched the witnesses. They took copious notes, and they were able to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt 34 for 34. And so I take great heart in that, and I think it's a great and shining example that the rule of law is alive and well in this country.
Yep, and the sentencing is 7-11, and we all get free orange Slurpees when he gets sentenced to jail.
That's right.